In this video, what we're going to do is go over how to model a bookcase, essentially going back to the basics. Start with bringing in an image, talking about how to approach the modeling, making sure it's to scale, and blocking it out before diving into the smaller details and using all the necessary modeling tools. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the bookcase I'm actually modeling is from the website All Modern. You can see the bookcase here. There's different images, which is great, different items on it, which can be helpful for populating it. Also important is the dimensions. And so what you'll see is I did take a screen capture of this and just added the overall dimensions so that I could see them. Now back in Cinema 4D, we're going to start by creating a plane. And I do think the orientation makes a lot more sense if it is in the positive Z direction here. We can take the segments down to 1 to clean things up. Now I have a couple of materials here because I want to point out if you apply a redshift material here, and this is just a regular redshift material, right? Standard material image of the bookcase with the dimensions added, it's still really pixely and blurry, hard to see. And I even tried coming into the material in the viewport section and setting the texture preview size to no scaling. So instead what I did is I created a standard Cinema 4D material, which you can do by + new standard material, loading the texture into there, unchecking reflectance. And now when I apply that same material there, notice how much clearer that is, right? So look at that text. There's the Cinema 4D material. There's the redshift material. So Cinema 4D material is going to be a lot easier to work with. So that's what we will do. And with that, what we're going to do is create a box that we will then input those dimensions for, so we can make sure our bookcase will be the right size. Now, these dimensions are in inches. Cinema 4D is in centimeters. That's not a big deal. All you have to do is type in IN or in to make sure it's the correct size. So that actually should have been in the Y for the height. The width should be 31.5. So that should be the dimension or length on the x-axis. Depth will be Z. You can kind of look at the gizmo here, or even your move tool for that, right? Height Y, width X, depth Z. So we have the first two set. The last is Z. We'll do 16 inches. And there we go. And now we can see this is what the size of the bookcase should be. This is what our plane is. And so now all we have to do is kind of scale the image down, and a front view might work a little bit better. So I'll hit F4 there just to kind of get this as close as possible. Now, does it have to be perfect? No. How much time you want to spend kind of working on that is entirely up to you. That looks pretty good. Once we're happy with that, what I'll do is select the plane, right click on it, go to rigging tags and choose a protection tag so I can't move it. And I even like to call this reference, so that way I know exactly what it is. So now we have our cube that we can start to kind of make our bookcase from. And, looking at the bookcase here, it's pretty simple. It is modern. I do think that's a great way to kind of start out learning to model, is simple modern furniture, bookcase, table, desk being very good examples of things to start with. And just kind of think about where you're going to need lines in order to define your geometry. And a bookcase here is very straightforward, where you have these lines, these separators that we're going to need in order to, create the shelves. So the drawers are a little bit different. We'll get to those. But for a bookcase, it's pretty easy. Now, there's a couple of different approaches you can take here. What I'm also going to do with this cube is put it in X-ray mode and then make it editable. And in fact, I really only need this front polygon. Okay. Now, if I'm smart, before I get rid of the rest, what I'll do is move this, maybe even a top view would help here, so that the back of the plane, cube lines up with the plane, or essentially almost 0 on the Z-axis. So that way, when I go to add that depth back in, I know exactly how far it should go. Okay, so I'll select this front polygon, invert my selection, also using the shortcut key UI, and delete it. And now what I'm going to do is just start cutting this up. Now, there's a couple of different ways you could approach cutting this. I'll hit F4 to switch to a front view here. So you could just use the line tool and kind of just cut in the middle. You could also just go through and cut in all of the actual spaces for this. Now, as I'm looking at this, I do want to resize this or move it around just a bit more, at least on the Y and X axes. It still looks maybe a bit tall, but that's fine. You know, the perspective or the picture here does have some perspective. So it's going to be, you know, hard to get this perfectly right. And that's why I'm working with really just the front part here, because that's the part that has the least amount of perspective or distortion from the camera and the angle this picture was taken. So what I'm going to do here is just start by cutting using my loop and path cut tool there, right click, there it is, or KL or ML. And I'm going to try to just cut in the middle. Okay. Now, once again, how precise you want to be is entirely up to you, depending on what you're using this for. If this is for the manufacturer of this bookcase, well, then it probably matters a little bit more. But if this is just for something in a personal project or even an architectural visualization project, maybe it doesn't matter quite as much. So that looks good. We'll actually make sure to do the bottom part as well there. And now I need to cut in these vertical shelves. And so what I'll do is hit spacebar to toggle out of that tool, switch to my brush selection, and select that first polygon. Now what I can do is hit spacebar again to toggle back to my loop path cut. And from there, what I'm going to want to do is make sure I check restrict to selection. I had already turned that on from just experimenting previously, but it shouldn't be on by default. So turn that on. And so now when I cut through here, notice how it only cut that polygon I had selected. Now, there are situations where this isn't necessarily a good thing, as you are creating n-gons or polygons with more than 4 sides. But for our purposes, that isn't a big deal. So for the next polygon, I'll make sure I select it. I hit spacebar to toggle back to my move tool. I'll hit spacebar again to toggle back to here. And you'll notice that our loop path cut tool is no longer working. And that's because we've created these n-gons, and so it's not quite sure, you know, where to cut. So we could maybe get 1 or 2 in if we selected some of these other polygons. However, instead what we'll do is right click and choose the line cut. Now you could also use plane cut, but line cut will also work. We want to make sure, well, actually restrict to selection doesn't really matter in this one. But what we're going to do is make sure this edge is highlighted here, click, and then you can kind of drag and tell it where you want to cut. Now the trick here is to use shift to make sure that line is straight or at a 45-degree angle for our cut. So I'll do that. We'll get that cut in there. Then I'll come down here, hit spacebar again, holding shift, cut, spacebar again, click on the edge, hold shift, make sure I extend to that next edge, click. And that is how we can do that. Now, because of the way we did this, we are going to run into a little bit of an issue when we inset the next step. It just means we'll have to fix it. So the advantage of doing it this way is that the next step is going to be a little bit quicker, a little bit easier versus us trying to, you know, cut in the exact same amount for, you know, each of these different places. Another way you could have done this would have been to just make a big area here like we had initially, and then make different cubes for the separators, dividers, whatever you want to call them. And there's nothing wrong with that way either. You know, when you're thinking about modeling an object, something you really want to take into consideration is how it would be built in the real world, the different pieces of wood that something like this would use, because that can help you approach it from a modeling point of view. That can also, you know, make a difference with how you want to apply the materials to it later on, as we'll see. I'll get into that a little bit. But this to me is the simplest way, even if it's not perfect down the road for some of the, you know, insetting stuff we're going to run into, or potentially the materials down the road as well. So what I'll do now is select all these polygons. All right. And actually maybe that one as well. And what we're going to do here is inset. Now, if we just try to inset these as is, once again, let me reset mine to the default. If you just inset, you'll notice it's keeping all of those polygons together, which maybe could potentially work, especially if you were going to use, you know, multiple cubes or objects for the shelves and dividers. But as we want to kind of do all of that at once, what we need to do is uncheck preserve groups. So now once we've unchecked preserve groups, notice how it treats each polygon separately. And so this works pretty well, but what ends up happening here is you end up with a certain thickness, right? Whatever the offset you've set. In this case, I don't know if that's quite 2 centimeters, but whatever it is, let's just say it's 2 centimeters there, and then double that in between. And so that makes this inconsistent. And once again, maybe that's okay for your purposes, although it is a bit strange. But that's relatively easy to fix. So what I would do is I am trying to kind of eyeball the thickness for kind of what we're seeing here, and then I'll adjust the outside portions. And it turns out for me, and this, it ends up being 1 centimeter, which is great, because then I know how much to kind of adjust the others by. It'll be half that. So if that looks good, all right, all I need to do is let go of my mouse, switch to my move tool, and then I can come here to my edge mode, select these 2 edges, and I need to move them down 0.5 centimeter. Now, the precise way of doing this, if that matters, is to come in here to our coordinate manager, and I can say, all right, that's on the y-axis, and I want it to go in the negative direction, so I'll just do negative 0.5, and that will move it down. And then I would also need to do it, I thought there was one other place, right here perhaps, and so that actually needs to come up 0.5, so I'll do that. Oops. I think I might have just done 5. So we'll do plus 0.5. There we go. And now I'll need to move in the exterior edges. So I'm selecting these. I'm using Shift to select all of them. Once I have them selected, I can see I need to move these in on the x-axis. And once again, I could just eyeball it, right? If I hold Shift, it will snap to 5 centimeters. So that's not quite right. But all I have to do is X, find that in here, and say plus 0.5, right? And then do the same thing to these. And with this, it's in the negative X direction, so we will subtract 0.5 minus 0.5. And there we go. So now everything should be consistent in terms of the spacing on the outside, the inside there. So that is looking pretty good. Now what we can do is kind of fill out the back part of this before creating the shelves themselves. And what we can do is go back to edge mode, and we need to select the outside edges. I'm pretty sure there's like a shortcut to select the border edge, but I'm just going to do it manually. So I'm going to hold Shift as I'm clicking and selecting all these edges. All right. In fact, we don't need that polygon, so I'll quickly switch to polygon mode, get rid of that one before going back to edge and selecting the edges all the way around. All right. And if you recall, I moved this forward enough to where the back of the bookcase should be even with the plane. So maybe going to a top view here, we can pull that back. That looks a bit off, but can always check it. Nope, that actually looks good. So it's pretty close. And not that it really should matter, but if I solo this, we can see that this is open. And we're pretty much to the point, at least for right now, where we could toggle off X-ray mode to kind of see that a bit easier. That really won't matter, but if we did want to close this off, we could right click, close polygon hole, and it will close it. And once again, we're creating a bunch of n-gons. Well, not necessarily a bunch, just one big one. If that is a big deal, what you could do would be line cut to come in here and, you know, kind of make those back to quads. Then you'd have to cut that one down at the end, but well, it isn't there. So it'd be a bit strange, but that would help. Though, like I said, for our purposes, n-gons aren't going to really matter. Let's put that back into X-ray mode just to be safe. And I'll unsolo this. Now what we can do is select our front polygons. All right, and you may think, oh, we can just delete these. Not quite. Instead, what we want to do is just extrude them. And I'm going to switch to a side view here because I'm going to want to extrude them almost to the back, but not all the way. I don't want them intersecting with those back polygons. So I can extrude, make sure we go back here, maybe something like that. Looks good. And I didn't actually check, but it's possible the website mentioned the shelf depth. If the accuracy, I need it to be that accurate. I don't think, what, half an inch, an inch, or whatever that is really going to matter. And so, yeah, we have our bookcase. Now, with this one, I don't actually want it all the way back there, just the way I'm going to build the shelves. So I'll just pull this up. And for the drawers, not shelves, we have a couple different ways we can approach that. We could do it very similarly to where we just kind of cut things in and extrude out the fronts of our drawers. But once again, think about how this would be made. These would be separate objects, the drawers. And so in this case, I'm going to use a cube just to kind of go through that. So as a cube, I'll put it in X-ray mode. Actually name this here so we can stay pretty organized. Cube, and I'm going to just start sizing this down to the size I need. And I can either do that, with this as a primitive, or if I decide it's going to be quicker and easier for me to just make it editable, which that'll be very soon, I'll go ahead and do that. I'm not sure why that was snapping there. So yeah, I'll hit C on my keyboard to make it editable, or you can hit the make editable button here, switch to point mode, rectangle selection, and just kind of move this in. And this is where, not being exact is okay because this is a bookcase. There's different tolerances here. There's going to be, it's not going to go all the way to edge. There's going to be a little bit of a gap there. And that's the type of thing that can add to the realism when you have those little gaps, those spacings, like you would expect to see on something in the real world. So something like that looks pretty good. And I need to check it from the side, right? Because that's not going to work. Once again, point mode here. I think it's just a little bit easier and quicker. This, I want to be at the front, but if it's not 100% perfect, that's okay. And then that can go towards the back, and that'll just give us that little bit of depth we were kind of seeing there. All right, so I need 3 more of those back to my front view, F4. And now back to my move tool, I'm going to just hold Control or Command on my keyboard. You can see my cursor changed, and now I can just pull down on the Y-axis and then do one more. All right, and that looks like lines up pretty good. So we have that. So if we turn the X-ray mode off again, you can see our bookcase here looking pretty good. We just have a couple little things left, mainly the bottom part. And actually, if we just solo this, you can see there are little, I suppose, supports here in the corners if you really, really wanted to do those. I'm going to, well, we can make those really quick because really if we just make one, I don't have a great idea of what the overall shape is. So maybe a little bit of imagination here. I'm going to just size this pretty small. And I almost wish these were in X-ray again. So I will select everything, make sure it's in X-ray, and back to a front view we go. Especially for something as flat as this, using a front view a lot is just fine. So maybe something like that. I probably do want this to be a square. So in the object tab, I can make sure that the X and Y sizes are the same. The Z, I'll change here in a second, but let's place that in the corner. And we can see, size-wise, it looks pretty close. Maybe even just hide the bookcase so we can see it a bit clear. So, all right, it's a bit small. So maybe we want something like that. That ends up being about 2.2 centimeters. Right, so that looks good. Show the bookcase again so we can center it. You can see the doesn't match up perfectly. I'm okay with that. And if I was modeling this for the manufacturer of the bookcase, I probably would have a higher resolution image and more detailed measurements. So I would just be working with those. So all right, that looks good in the corner there. Switch to a side view because I think it's way too long. Let's make this editable. So we can kind of scale it there. I'm going to assume it goes all the way to the back. Point mode, move it to the front. Something like, actually, I don't think it probably goes all the way to the front, but you can do something like that. And then if I just wanted to add maybe a little bit more detail to this, we could bevel maybe one of these edges. I'm guessing if they were going to bevel one, it might be this one. So we could just come in here, bevel, do something like that. Maybe add a couple of subdivisions. Yeah, it's just a nice little detail there. And then I would just kind of duplicate that out to the other corners in places. And one thing I could do to help with that, not that I necessarily need it with something this low polygon, but I could use my instance object. So with that selected, and why don't we name this? Because we should be naming things. Can come here, select instance, and it creates a support instance, which is really just referencing that object. So if for whatever reason I need to come back and adjust, say, the length here, maybe this does end up needing to come all the way to the front. Notice how it works on the instance as well. So that can just make my life easier. I won't have to reduplicate these out. But yeah, I would just come here, once again, precision, not that big of a deal. If it was, I probably would move the object axis to the top left-hand corner there, and then use snap to position this more quickly and precisely. And, when I was using 3D Studio Max many, many years ago, it would have annoyed me not to have these snapped in the corner, but it's something over time that I've kind of got used to and essentially embraced. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's group all of those. Right click, select them all, or select them all, then right click. So keep that clean. And that really just leaves us now with this bottom part. And it looks like it's really just kind of a few different rectangles with maybe kind of like another part going across there. So what I can do is go to a side view, F3 on my keyboard, and I'm going to create this rectangle object. And it's way too big, so I'll start to scale it down. Maybe something like that. Get it positioned up top there. And that's about when I make it editable and start working with this. Once again, in point mode, kind of moving the points where they need to be. Something like that. Great. And I can go to the front view to see how tall this should be. And I can see that's a bit too tall. Though if I move it over to the side here, I can probably get a little bit better idea of that. Lining it up with the y-axis there. So still maybe a bit too tall. That looks pretty good based on what pixels I have. And so that's what we have. And what we're gonna do is use a sweep to create geometry from this. So I'm gonna create my sweep, place this rectangle inside, create another rectangle, and make that a child of the sweep as well, making sure it's on top. And that's what we have here. So this is obviously way too large. Let's set the width and height to 1. And now you can kind of see what we're doing here. Something like that. Looks pretty good. And, it's a bit unfortunate. I mean, not to bring up 3D Studio Max again, but the sweep controls might have even be called something different. You had a lot more options here where you could change the pivot of this. And we could do kind of the same thing here by changing the object axis so that we could move it down and to the left so that we don't have to refine our rectangle shape, but I'm just gonna work with our rectangle shape here to get this to kind of line up the way I like. So probably just the easier way of doing this, even if I don't like it. So that looks good. And then we probably just need to move the whole thing a little bit like that. And the reason why I didn't want to kind of work with the object axis of this rectangle is because now I can round it just a little bit, right? Rounded edges, another big kind of detail and part of working realistically. So that looks pretty good for this one. I'm going to use that same concept as we did with the supports by using an instance. All right, now what I didn't do with the sweep, which would have helped, is center the axis. So I'm going to select this rectangle and go Tools, Axis, Center Parent to, and that will move the sweep. And so now the instance is there, and honestly, kind of not great because now this is going to be a bit off, and that is actually something that'll bother me, that these won't be perfectly positioned, but that's fine. We'll pretend like I spent more time making that perfect, but that should be pretty good. And then really I just need like maybe a line going across here and a couple of lines going across there. So I could create that line using my pen tool. I'm actually going to just create another rectangle though. Actually, scratch that. Yeah. I'll start with this rectangle, make it editable, and I'm just going to uncheck close spline and then delete this point and this point. So I have that. And then I'll put that in a sweep again. Use that same rectangle. I could even instance that rectangle if I wanted to get super fancy. And now all I have to do is adjust this to make it work. So let's see there, point mode. Let's go into a front view. And I'm going to make sure I keep these points straight. So even as I work, I can move this up. Something like that. And I can see I didn't move that far enough over, so we'll do that. But now this can move over here. I don't mind if this intersects a little bit. Probably would be fewer pieces than what I'm making, but that, something like that. This can go right there. And the reason why I created just that single line is because now, once I have it positioned where I want, well, I don't know why I'm in a top view, meant to hit F1, that line where I want, and I work with the object axis just like I did before, I'm going to duplicate that out. So we can have it be our bottom support as well. So the object axis is way up here at the origin. Same for our, actually, I don't know if it's at the origin. Nope, it is. But that's not going to work. So I'll start by going with my rectangle selected, tools, axis, center axis 2. And then I'll do the same thing, tools, axis, center parent 2, which will move the sweep. And so that I'm going to want right there. And I do care about the way this intersection looks. So something like that. And this probably would be potentially one continuous piece, but if there's a little bit of a gap, that's fine. And there's probably one in the back there. So we could copy that or make an instance of it. And then we'll do the same thing because there's that middle support. So something like that. Looks like it's somewhat in the middle. And so with that, we are now done modeling. I would probably still organize this a bit more, call this the metal parts of it. We have our supports, definitely name these shelves, or not shelf, drawer. I don't know why I keep doing that. Drawer 1, drawer 2, and then drawer 3. And, oh, except I think I got the order wrong. Could potentially group those as well if you are trying to, do that. At some point, though, with the organization, it can get a little bit too much. So we have our bookcase. All right, drawers, we can turn off X-ray on. And with the modeling done, we can move on to the materials. Now, I talked earlier about different pieces and how we may want to think about that when modeling. That's also important when it comes to the materials. So I have a wood material that I just grabbed from the material manager. Asset browser, so you can find it in there. Now I'm going to apply it to the supports, the drawers, and the actual bookcase part of this. And I'm also going to create a dome light just so we can see this. I'm not going to worry about putting a texture into there. And at this point, we can probably turn off the reference as well. But if we go ahead and kind of render this, we're going to see that our pattern is way too big on our object, maybe. Okay, there we go, right? And it's even looking a little bit stretched. So, the easiest way to fix that, rather than laying out the UVs for this, would be just to switch the projection from UVW mapping to cubic. And you can see that's definitely going to help on the sides to make things look a lot better. But now the size is clearly too large. Now you could go in here to the individual textures and adjust the scale of each one, all right? Or even use a node and then link it to each of those textures. Or what you can do is adjust the tiles here. So if I set this to say 3, it's going to repeat that texture 3 times. That makes the size quite a bit smaller. But now we have the issue with the wood grain and where it really isn't going the correct way. Now, if you go back to the original picture, and I know my wood grain is quite a bit different in color, if we can zoom in a bit, you'll see that the wood grain is kind of going vertically here, vertically there, and then horizontally there. Typically, think about these as different pieces of wood, and you can kind of see how that top is a separate piece from the side. And so that's how you want to think about your materials. Now, because we modeled the main part of this is a single piece, that can be a little bit trickier to do, because how do we decide where exactly we should switch from, say, vertical to horizontal? And so if we had modeled this and cut straight across, that would have helped. Had we used different pieces, that would have helped. But what you can do, and I'm not going to do this for everything, but I will just kind of show you how to approach this, would be to select, say, something on the sides here where we go, yes, we absolutely need the wood grain to be a different direction here. And it's going to be primarily these parts, but there's some other pieces as well. Well, I guess we're going to do a little bit more than I envisioned, but that's perfectly fine. Right? So what we'll do is save this selection out. Select, store selection. Call this wood grain. Maybe we should call it, V for vertical. And then what we'll do is take another copy of our material. All right, and actually scratch that. Rather than take another copy and drag it on here, right? Because this is going to have the original settings of the projection and the tiles. And we don't want to have to adjust that again. You can just duplicate the material tag that's already on there. So if you select it, hold Control, and then drag, we have that same copy, which will then preserve or keep the same settings we adjusted before. Then all we need to do is take our polygon selection tag, drag it into the selection option there. And nothing's changed yet, because now what we need to do is go into texture mode. And what we can do is just rotate this. So it's maybe a little bit hard to see with our HDRI on, but that's what we're seeing. So now what we can do, see as I rotate this 90 degrees, the wood direction changes. So you can use this to change direction, right? You can also use this to change size if you wanted it narrow or thicker. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do it this way, but you could. All right. I would probably go into the tiles and adjust it there. But this same option could be used to change the wood grain, or that same kind of adjustment to change the wood grain here on the drawers. So if for whatever reason the drawers were getting the same wood, and they're not just because of the way we applied this. If we were to apply this to each one, I bet we get the same wood grain, right? So, that's kind of what we would get. Now, in this case, the grouping worked out very well since it kind of got around that. But if for whatever reason you have an object where you can't do this, or if you do want to change the pattern on a specific object like this, select your tag, go into texture mode again, and then you can just move this up or down. Although I'm not sure why we're not seeing it. Update wood grain. That's really strange. I would have thought, based on the rotating, so that works. But then why doesn't? Okay. That is very strange. So that should be working. I'm not sure why it isn't. Cubic. Yeah, I don't. That's really, really odd, but that should work. And you can kind of see it like works the second we rotate it, but it doesn't there. I wonder, is it, if we switch that to world, that is the strangest thing. Everything else, no, scaling doesn't work either now. I must be doing something wrong, but thankfully for our purposes today, we can just put it on everything and that works. Though in reality, you should be able to move it up and down just like this and change the wood grain on specific objects. I don't know. Yeah, that's, I don't know. That's baffling. All right. But overall, that's looking good for the wood material. Now for the metal material here, pretty straightforward. I'll create a standard material, a redshift standard, although, nope, that's what I got. Double click on it to open it up and come in here, going to set the metalness to 1. And honestly, that's probably not too far off. Maybe I want a little bit more roughness. But if we go back to our image, if that's what you're trying to match, that is kind of a dark, wood there. So, or I'm sorry, metal. So that's looking pretty good, at least just from the material preview here. So I can apply that. The bevel here is really going to help. And what you could potentially try is on the bookcase, adding a bevel deformer. Now that might screw up our selection, but we can give that a try and see what happens. So we take our bevel deformer, make it a child of our bookcase. You can see that's way too much. And yeah, that's kind of what I thought might happen, but let's see. So we do something like that. You know, that may be too small to where we really don't see the issue, any kind of projection issues. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a bit off. The other option would be, if you wanted to do it a different way, would be in here, just to use a rounded corners. So if you use like a round corners, can plug it in there. We also have a bump map, so that would require a bump map blender. Not terribly difficult to use, but you know, just something else to think about. But those could be some other ways to take this just a bit further. Now, one last thing before I call this complete. I'm not going to actually go through and do it, but if you're curious what I did to kind of fill this out for the thumbnail, there is a scene in the asset browser called Office Scene. And so I just grabbed different books, plants, things from here and just populated the bookcase. So like to kind of be as transparent as possible when it comes to that. And then, actually the scene I used for the thumbnail as well, just to kind of finish this off. I think it was under models. It was under, recently used would probably be there, but that doesn't help. Oh shoot, where was it? All example scenes, there it is. Architectural visualization, scenes. And I started with the home office one and kind of just, took a corner of that, made a few changes in order to use that for the thumbnail. So I think with that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care.